Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. We're all familiar with Amazing Grace, but do you know the history behind it? These were the words of John Newton, a former slave ship captain. At the age of 11, John Newton's mother died, and he went to sea with his father. Young John Newton fell in love with Mary Catlett while on shore leave one time, but he overstayed his visit. He missed his ship's departure, and in 1744 he was caught by a press gang and dragged onto the ship HMS Harwich, where he was forced to be a sailor. He tried to desert the ship, but was caught, stripped to the waist, and flogged with 8 dozen lashes. John Newton later wrote in a letter, "Like an unwary sailor who quits his port just before a rising storm, I renounced the hopes and comforts of the gospel at the very time when every other comfort was about to fail me." His reckless, godless behavior caused him to be traded to a slave ship. Being a continual problem, John Newton intentionally was left on a slave plantation in Sierra Leone, West Africa. So even the slave ship didn't want him. John Newton was finally rescued from Africa, but he continued his immoral life in the slave trade. He actually would deride Christians with such blasphemy that it shocked even the sailors. John Newton wrote in 1778, "How industrious is Satan served! I was formerly one of his active under-temptors, and had my influence been equal to my wishes, I would have carried all the human race with me. A common drunkard or profligate is a petty sinner to what I was." In 1747, John Newton was on the slave ship Greyhound. The ship was caught in a storm so terrible that he was convinced they would sink. He prayed for the first time in his life. Someone then gave John Newton a copy of Thomas à Kempis' Imitation of Christ, and then he began to read the Bible. Newton finally left the slave trade. John Newton wrote, "I am not the man I ought to be. I am not the man I wish to be, and I am not the man I hope to be, but by the grace of God, I am not the man I used to be." Afflictions quickened us to prayer. It is a pity it should be so, but experience testifies that a long course of ease and prosperity without painful changes has an unhappy tendency to make us cold and formal in our secret worship. But troubles rouse our spirits and constrain us to call upon the Lord in good earnest when we feel in need of that help which we only can have from His almighty arm. Afflictions are useful and, in a degree, necessary to keep alive in us a conviction of the vanity and unsatisfying nature of the present world and all its enjoyments, to remind us that this world is not our rest, and to call our thoughts upward where our true treasure is and where our heart ought to be. When things go on much to our wish, our hearts are too prone to say, "It is good to be here." John Newton was inspired to become a minister himself, and eventually he was ordained into the ministry in 1764. He was assigned to a little village, Olney, in Buckinghamshire. A few years later, in 1767, poet William Cowper moved to Olney, and with his help, Newton and William Cowper wrote hymns. Their songs were first published in 1779. The collection was called Olney Hymns. The Olney hymns included, "Oh, for a closer walk with God," "God moves in a mysterious way," and "There is a fountain filled with blood." Many influential leaders in England attended John Newton's services. In 1795, a famous British member of Parliament, William Wilberforce, came to have a living faith in Jesus through the help of John Newton. William Wilberforce initially wanted to become a preacher, but John Newton persuaded him to serve God by fighting slavery in the British Parliament, as Britain was the world's largest slave trader in the 19th century. Wilberforce wrote in his journal, "My walk is a public one. My business is in the world. I must mix in the assemblies of men or quit the post which Providence seems to have assigned me." A man who acts from the principles I profess reflects that he is to give an account of his political conduct at the judgment seat of Christ. Parliament finally passed an act abolishing the slave trade in 1807, but it took 26 more years to abolish slavery throughout the British Empire. Well, John Newton wrote, "Although my memory's fading, I remember two things very clearly. I am a great sinner, and Christ is a great Savior." Well, that's all we have time for, but I want to thank you for watching and encourage you to watch this program again at tct.tv. Again, thank you so much for watching as we remember John Newton and William Wilberforce and how they fought slavery. God bless.